All right, well, good evening and welcome to this edition of History and Highballs. We're so glad that you're joining us for this evening's program, History and Highballs Bordeaux, a history of the world's most famous wine. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. So whenever you join us for one of these History and Highball programs, you and I will get to virtually spend the evening together listening to some incredible stories about North Carolina places and people and what makes our state so special. Tonight's program is just one of many exciting virtual offerings available through MOH. So if you'd like to learn more about our History at Home initiative, head on over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. This is also where you can learn more about shopping in our wonderful museum shop, as well as becoming an associates member. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programming like this evening's program possible. We would like to thank all of those of you who donated funds towards this evening's program. We do our best to keep our programs free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping our series going. And we just continue to be so appreciative of your generous support of the museum. A few quick housekeeping items for this evening. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the program and to please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, our adult programs intern Alexandra will ask the speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce, or rather reintroduce, this evening's speaker, Dr. Charles Ludington, Department of History for North Carolina State University. Ludington was a visiting fellow for the Irish National Institute for Historical Research at University College Cork, a constituent university of the National University of Ireland, and has published essays on the Huguenot diaspora in Ireland, British and Irish political thought in the late Stuart era, and the history of wine consumption in Britain from the mid-17th century to the mid-19th century. His first book, The Politics of Wine in Britain, A New Cultural History, published in 2013, used wine consumption as a window onto English, Scottish, and British political culture from Cornwall to Queen Victoria. He currently teaches early modern and modern British history, European history, and European intellectual history. Welcome, Dr. Ludington, or welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Stacy. What a pleasure to be here again and to be on this show. I hope, of course, in the future that we can be together in person in the future and to do these events, because I've really enjoyed them so much. And I hope everybody enjoys tonight's program as well. We're going to be talking about Bordeaux wine, of course, and it's a wine that many of you have probably heard of, but it's also a wine that has a reputation that can be a little bit intimidating. So I'm going to try to talk some about the history of Bordeaux wine and make it a little bit less intimidating, and maybe also help you figure out ways you might want to, or what you might want to purchase, not by giving you specific names, but just being able to know a little more about the wine and what the grapes are might help you a little bit. And then I'm going to also take you back a little bit to the last talk I gave on St. Patrick. Therefore, I'm going to go back to Ireland, which is part of this story. Irish merchants are part of this story. And then we'll end up back in North Carolina, linking all of this to our own history in our own wine industry, which is growing, especially in the Yadkin River Valley, but in other parts of the state as well. So let me share my screen to start here. And as usual, this takes a little bit of, there we go. Stacy, everything on your end fine? I assume it is.
It looks perfect.
Yep. Okay, great. So Bordeaux, a history of the world's most famous wine. That again is the title of today's talk. And I've just told you how it's going to proceed. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time to ask questions, and hopefully I'll have time to answer them. So off we go. Bordeaux itself, of course, is both a city and a wine region in France. If you look here on this map, you can see this red section here. Let me turn my, oops, somehow that managed to do that. Turn my pen on. It should work now. No, it's not working. It's just causing me some problems. So I'm going to use just my cursor here. This red section in southwestern France is the region, the Bordeaux wine growing region. In the middle of that, on the left bank of the river, the Gironde River, which becomes the Garonne River, it's kind of confusing, is the city of Bordeaux. So here you get a sense of the relative location of the Bordeaux wine region within France as a whole. And you see its size compared to other wine regions in France as well. It's much larger than its rival Burgundy, which is here with a few outlying areas up here, although most of the wine is made in this part of Burgundy. But that's its big rival, but neither is by any means the largest wine producing area in all of France. Here we see a little more of a close-up of the Bordeaux wine region. As I mentioned before, the river coming in from the sea is called the Gironde River. It splits just past or just above the city of Bordeaux, and it splits into what's called the Garonne River here, and then the Dordogne River over here. The Garonne goes all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains, and the Dordogne takes you past the caves of Lascaux and other areas of troglodytic France into the center of France. So these are some of the big names of the sub-regions within Bordeaux that you see here: Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, et cetera, et cetera. So that's basically an idea of where Bordeaux is within France, and then some of the sub-regions within Bordeaux that you've probably heard of. You may have heard of Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, Entre-deux-Mers, Sauternes. Again, all those are names that are part of the larger Bordeaux region. Not everybody's aware that when you buy a Pauillac or a Margaux, you're buying a Bordeaux. When you buy a Sauterne, it's a type of Bordeaux, very different from the kind of wine we'll be talking about tonight, because it's sweet and white, becomes amber with age. Mostly we're focusing on red wine from Bordeaux. But Bordeaux is a diverse region, making red wines, rosé wines, white wines, dry white wines, and sweet wines. There's even a little tiny bit of sparkling wine made there. But to give you a little more about the region, something that might help you when you're thinking about buying wine and what to look for on the label, because it's very confusing in many ways to American consumers. Bordeaux is the home of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, and yet French custom does not place the name of the grape on the bottle in most instances. It's sold by the region and the regional reputation. And so only people who know about the wine know the grape name. They buy according to the place name, not to the grape name. Now, the place name means nothing to Americans, so we, of course, label our wines with the grapes. But some of the most famous grapes in the world come from the Bordeaux region. Specifically, on the left bank of what's called the left bank of the Gironde and then the Garonne River, that really is Cabernet Sauvignon territory, although almost all Bordeaux wines are blended. That is, there's more than one grape. By the way, that's true in California too, where you have to have 75% of one grape to have it on the label. But you might buy a Cabernet Sauvignon from California and not know that it's not 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, that anywhere from 25 to 10% or even 2% of the wine is something else, probably Merlot. So again, on the left bank, this purpley area up here, which is probably the most expensive area, that's called the Médoc. That's this peninsula, is the Médoc Peninsula. That's Cabernet Sauvignon territory. Moving down this, again, the Gironde becomes the Garonne River. The Garonne River goes past the city of Bordeaux. Down here is also Cab and Merlot territory, as well as white wine territory. This orange area here I'm pointing to with my cursor is, again, a mix of red and white. Mostly Cab, actually about 50-50 Cab and Merlot here, mostly Cab up here with lesser amounts of Merlot. These bright yellow areas are famous for their sweet wine made with the Semillon grape. You see Semillon spelled down here. You go across the river, or sorry, this area is inexpensive Bordeaux's. They're just generic Bordeaux's, so they don't have a fancy, the name of the village on them, as you see up in these other areas. And that's generally a sign. If it just says Bordeaux and doesn't give the name, has the name of the chateau, but not the name of the town or the village, that's generally a sign of a less fancy wine. That, along with cost, is also an indicator. So sweet white wines here, mixed red and white wines here, inexpensive red wines here, generally inexpensive red wines here, in these pink areas, also inexpensive red wine. This area, entre deux mers, which means between the two seas, which is really, of course, between the two rivers, is noted for its inexpensive white wine, generally made with Sauvignon Blanc, sometimes with some Semillon in it as well. And then moving again north, you see this area is really the Merlot heartland right here around Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. And then most of this is also Merlot-based red wines up here. So again, there are different parts of Bordeaux. They all specialize in different wines. But if you really like Cabernet Sauvignon, you want wines from the left bank. If you like Merlot, wines from the right bank. And if you like white wines, wines from the middle part here, although they are grown throughout, or white grapes are also grown throughout. And the sweet wines, again, down here, including this little village, whose name you've probably heard of, Cadillac. It's one of the areas where they grow, one of the villages around which they grow sweet wine. So that gives you a sense of Bordeaux and the region and the different grapes that go into that. Well, we're going to be focusing mostly on Bordeaux red wine today. And just to give you a sense of some of the aromas and flavors that people often attribute to that wine, black currants, probably the most common, cedar, like the wood, of course, pencil shavings, so the slight sweetness that you get from lead pencil shavings, plum, depending on the degree of ripeness, plum all the way to prune, although prune is, when it gets that pruny, and the grapes are probably a little bit cooked, blackberry, tobacco, something that we in North Carolina should be quite familiar with. Interestingly, the southwestern part of France is also a tobacco growing region. Of course, that's a plant that came from our part of the world and went to theirs, although we now grow their grapes here. So there's been an exchange that we'll talk about more at the end too. Some other flavors and aromas you get in Bordeaux red wines, which are a little more controversial because they are not loved by everybody, are green pepper. That's often a sign that the grapes are a little bit underripe. And then leather. Not everybody likes the sort of animal, gamey smell of leather, but some people love it, just as some people love the green pepper flavors or smells. So these are some general descriptors of what you might find in Bordeaux wines. Merlot-based, that is right bank wines, tend to be rounder and a little more fruit forward. That is a little more of the plum and the blackberry in particular, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon has a little more tannin, that is grip in the mouth. Black currants and cedar are probably the things you find most there. At least that's what I get out of them most of the time when I'm drinking Bordeaux wines. Here you see a cluster of Cabernet Sauvignon just before being harvested. So you get a sense of what the grapes look like. Well, how did modern Bordeaux wine become so famous for quality? That's the big question we're asking today. Well, for producers of Bordeaux, their answer is that it's a natural product of the land. That is, they want to naturalize Bordeaux. They want you to think it's just there. It comes just by growing these grapes and then turning it into wine. You naturally have this superior product. Well, that's actually, of course, not what makes Bordeaux so famous. And we're going to be we're looking at the history and trying to answer the question of what does make it so famous. So in 1953, a French historian, actually, who is a historical geographer named Henri Enjalbert, wrote in a famous French magazine, or it's a journal called Annales, that the creation of quality vineyards depended more upon the influence of the importers of the wine than upon the actual qualities of the terroir, that is the land and the climate all combined. So in other words, it's not just a product, a natural product of the land. In fact, it was the market that created the wine. And the most important market for Bordeaux wine was England. Well, you can imagine the idea that the English market created the fame of Bordeaux did not go down well with proud French people. So this also started not just a more popular debate, but a debate among historians and historical geographers. So you have a response. There are many smaller responses, but some of the more famous responses come from the 1960s, a man named François-Georges Parizet. His response was, no, it's not the market that created it. It was the estate manager, what they called the régisseur, who oversaw the vineyard, the winemaking, and the initial sale of the wine. And he brought, it was almost always a he, generations of experience in trying to make the best wine. And it was this experience that caused slow innovation that created the glory of Bordeaux wine. So in other words, he's saying it was much more the person, and that is the French person in particular, who created the glory of Bordeaux wine. So he's taking it away from the English market. Another response was from a Frenchman named René Pijassou, who was a geologist. And he said, no, in fact, it is what the French call the terroir, that is the land, the climate, the slope. All of that is what creates Bordeaux, the glory, the fame of Bordeaux wine. And he said it, both the climate and in particular, the gentle gravel mounds, there's not big hills around Bordeaux, but you have these subtle undulations, and the soil is really poor on the top of these mounds because it's made of gravel. That is gravel that was drained slowly from as the Pyrenees Mountains were eroded by glaciers. It created these mounds of gravel, and it's on top of these mounds of gravel, what the French call coupe gravière, that are the best wines are always produced, because they have the gravel itself allows the wines to drain, the vines to drain, and therefore they don't accumulate too much water, they concentrate, and this is what creates the fame and glory of Bordeaux. Well, as you'll see, I have an answer, or I have an argument that goes along or is part of this historiographical debate, which we'll come to in a minute. But going back to this earlier point I made, which is that it was the English who were buying most of Bordeaux. And that certainly could not be denied. But some of you might be asking, understandably, why the English? Why were they buying so much of a wine that came from France? Well, the answer there is that for 301 years, Bordeaux was actually English. But to tell you a little more about Bordeaux and the words I'm going to be using, it was originally called claret, and that the English and the Irish and the Scottish use the term claret, which comes from the French word claret, meaning clear. It was a type of dark rosé wine that you still see in Bordeaux today. Claret de Bordeaux, as it's called, again, still found today, but it's rarely sold outside of Bordeaux itself. So it's very much of a regional specialty. But the word claret adhered to wine from Bordeaux even as the wine changed. And that's why the English term claret means red wine from Bordeaux, even though it derives from a period when it meant a dark rosé wine or a light red wine. From the Middle Ages up to the 18th century, most of this claret, or claret in general, was typical not only of the wines coming out of Bordeaux, but of French wine in general. That is, it was relatively light in color, wasn't dark red, but light red. It was relatively thin in body, and it needed to be consumed within the year of production. The French have a slightly pejorative term for that kind of wine. They call it piquette. That was typical of most French wines, which were consumed in a manner that wasn't very formal. And in fact, one of the things that's different about wine producing cultures is they tend not to be overly formal and certainly not terribly, well, I guess formal would be the best word I can know about wine consumption in general, because it's an everyday drink. Historically, it has been for them, just like beer in Germany is something that doesn't require much pretension, doesn't involve much pretension. That isn't to say that the French can't make wine pretentious just like everybody else. But again, broadly speaking, it's something the French drink without all the fanfare that comes from happens in countries that import wine. So for 301 years, Bordeaux belonged to the English. And this was the type of wine that they were drinking, and that Bordeaux was making and exporting. Just to give you, let me go ahead here and see this picture here, and I'll go back to that other slide. So historically, again, a light red or dark rosé wine. Here you see a picture of that wine, just to give you a sense of the color. Again, you can still get this wine in Bordeaux itself. Going back to this slide, we see here exactly why Bordeaux was once English, and that is in 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II, the Plantagenet king of England. And she brought with her in her dowry all of this territory in pink, the heart of which is Aquitaine. So in the middle of that, or at least on the western side, but sort of in the middle, is the city of Bordeaux. And so it's for this reason, from 1152 until 1453, that is the end of the 100 Years' War, that all of this territory, well, the city of Bordeaux, I should say, and much of that territory, because the 100 Years' War meant a fluctuating frontier, but for this reason, Bordeaux, the city, and the area around it, belonged to the kings of England for 301 years. In 1453, however, the war ended just east of Bordeaux in a place called Castillon, which is actually part of the Bordeaux winemaking region. And the territories, you see all of these territories here, had once belonged to the kings of England. Those territories were lost. There was nothing left to the English but the little port city of Calais up here in the northern part of France today, just across from the cliffs of Dover. So during that time, again, the wine they drank was the dark pink or light red wine known as Clairette. And there again is the picture of that wine. You'll have to go to Bordeaux probably to find it. It's hard to find outside, as I said. Well, what type of wine continued even after 1453, because that's what the English were used to, that's what they liked. However, in 1660, a man named Arnaud de Pontac had an idea, which was to make a different type of wine, a darker, more concentrated wine from a circumscribed area, and giving that area a name and marketing it to elites, specifically to the restored court in England in 1660. That is, in 1649, Charles I's head was cut off by the radical Puritan parliamentarian members of parliament. And then in 1660, his son Charles was restored to the throne. And this Frenchman named Arnaud de Pontac, who was himself a French nobleman and who owned a very nice vineyard just outside of the city of Bordeaux, had the idea of marketing a new type of wine for the newly arrived and installed English court. Here you see a document, probably the most famous document I've ever found in the archives. And it is the cellar book of Charles II, starting in 1660. And the fourth entry down is a purchase of Haut-Brion wine. That's Hautbrion. It's in Latin here, Haut-Briono. But that was the prototype of dark Bordeaux wine that would change over time, gradually, the nature and reputation of Bordeaux and transform the general industry from one that produced rosé wines, what I've been calling Clairette, into a darker red wine known to the English as Claret. Well, you have this idea of a fine wine from Bordeaux out there, but it's incredibly expensive to produce. Few people are doing so. Most English consumers still want their claret and not yet their darker wine. However, between 1678 and 1697, French wine in England that had been favored because of the old connection between England and France went from being the least taxed wine to the most heavily taxed wine. And this had three dramatic effects. First, most English consumers could no longer afford claret or any other French wine. Instead, they turned to Portuguese and Spanish wines. Then, back in France, Bordeaux producers and merchants had to make a better quality wine in order to reach the English market. In other words, they now had to do what that Arnaud de Pontac had done and create a finer wine in order to reach that English market that was paying the same amount of tax on French wine, regardless of the quality. As a result, Bordeaux wine went upscale and it became a clear status symbol of the elite in England. Here you see some pictures of aristocrats in early 18th century drinking, and this is from 1720s, drinking what's almost certainly finer Bordeaux wine. Here you see a lawyer and a retired naval officer, that is, gentlemen who thought of themselves as being polite, just like those aristocrats, even if they didn't have a title. And indeed, Bordeaux wine was part of a display of polite society. That is, polite society emphasized things like architectural details and mahogany tables and Persian rugs. That is, this was a period in English history in which people were tired of talking about politics and religion. Instead, they wanted to talk about things, especially things that money could buy through trade. And so you see, again, a massive change in English elite culture. It becomes much more material. And among those material objects that people loved to talk about in order to assert their polite status was wine. And the finer the wine, the more polite it was. So again, here's a picture from Mompesson House down in Salisbury, England, and it's an 18th century interior. And of course, you see a bottle of dark red wine on the dining table. Well, what still about the reputation? How did this become something that was greater simply than a wine that was made for elites? How did this reputation spread out? Well, as I said, the wealthy English market did matter. The estate managers and their knowledge did matter. Bordeaux terroir, that is again, the climate, the geography, all that combined, that did matter. But so too did the men who were selling the wine to the English, and mostly those were Irish merchants. They were the ones who helped to create the reputation of Bordeaux wines and to transform Bordeaux from a generally dark rosé wine, with perhaps a few exceptions like Haut-Brion, to an industry in which almost all the wine was dark red and of higher quality. Well, to know how that happened, you need to know a little bit about the wine trade in the 18th century in Bordeaux. First of all, you have, by the vineyards themselves, they're run by the estate manager. He sold the wine within weeks, or if he was unlucky, months after vinification. That is, the grapes were harvested, they were crushed, they became wine after a few days as the yeast ate the sugar. I don't want to go into that process. That's too long to describe. But you have a relatively young wine, what you might think of as en primeur wine in Bordeaux today. And that was sold right away if the regisseur was lucky, because they needed the cash. They also didn't know how to sell the wines because they didn't know the foreign markets. They had no entry into those foreign markets, so they had to sell the wine to foreign merchants. Moreover, they had no place to age the wines, and aging the wines is expensive. They'd rather pass that cost on to somebody else. Well, who was that somebody else? It was foreign merchants, what the French called négociants. These merchants purchased the wine sometimes with the help of brokers, that is, who put the vineyard owners in touch with the merchants. They knew about the vintage, the vineyards, and the available stock. These merchants had cash. They knew the foreign markets because they came from those foreign markets, and they had riverfront warehouses, which they used to raise the wine. So this is an important point to make, which is that in the 18th century, really up into the 20th century, the merchants were the ones who raised the wine. They were what the French called the éleveurs. The winemakers themselves didn't spend long with the wine. They were really more vineyard caretakers. They made the wine young, and they sold it as young as possible to these merchants, who then would raise the wine. And that meant things like racking the wine from barrel to barrel every few months, clarifying the wine in the process, fining the wine with egg whites, that is, taking out the particulate matter, aging the wine. All those things need to be done to make a wine better quality. Here's a engraving showing the activity along the waterfront in Bordeaux. That is, it's a very wide river. And on the left, you have warehouses. That wine is being taken out to the ships. Or it's coming out and going in. That is, the vineyards were on the river, up the river, and sometimes down the river. And they would come in, they would unload the wine. It would go into the warehouses where the merchants would raise it. And then when it was time for to be sold, it would be rolled back out onto ships, which would then head off to foreign markets, as well as markets in northern France. Brittany was a particularly large consumer of inexpensive French wines, or inexpensive Bordeaux wine. Well, why were Irish merchants so prominent? First of all, there were the thing called the penal laws, that is, series of laws that were particularly difficult made life particularly difficult for Irish Catholics, as well as for Irish Presbyterians, that is, non-Anglican Protestants. It inhibited their ability, in fact, prevented them from becoming things like lawyers and doctors and professionals in general, or being officers in the army, or even regular soldiers in the army until the 18th century. Also, the Irish Woollen Prohibition Act, passed by the English Parliament, harmed many Protestant landowners as well as Catholic landowners, but there were fewer in Ireland by 1698. That is, by essentially prohibiting the importation of Irish wool into England. And then it's important to say that Ireland was an agrarian society where there were relatively few commercial opportunities for ambitious men who were not born into land. So it's also important to say that the French disliked the English. Perhaps hate is too strong, I maybe should change that word. And they liked the Irish on the grounds that they knew that the Irish also had problems with the English, that there had been friction between them historically. So again, this is the 18th century, where the English certainly didn't think much of the French either, I should point out. So for these reasons, Irish merchants flocked to Bordeaux. It was also very welcoming to the Irish. There was an Irish Catholic seminary to train Catholic priests, because that had been forbidden in Ireland since the Reformation, that is, since the 1530s, when Henry VIII, who was the Lord of Ireland, and then who became technically the King of Ireland in 1542, when he proscribed Catholicism, when he broke from Rome, he also got rid of the training for Catholic priests, so you had to go abroad to be trained. Bordeaux had an Irish Catholic seminary. For Irish Protestants, Bordeaux also, ironically, happened to be a welcoming place because it was a cosmopolitan city. Many French Huguenots lived there. Many is probably too strong. It had a prominent French Huguenot community. But it's interesting because France at that point was as discriminating or discriminatory against French Protestants as Ireland was against Irish Catholics. Nevertheless, there was a Huguenot, that is French Protestant community in Bordeaux, as well as foreign merchants from the north of Europe who were themselves Protestant. And they were allowed to live there because of their trade, which brought in tax revenue to the French government. So even though technically it was illegal to be Protestant, after 1685 in France, the French tax collectors looked the other way because they wanted the revenue brought in by both French Protestants as well as foreign merchants who came from Northern Europe, who were Anglican or Presbyterian, or that's another name for Calvinist, or Lutheran if they were from Northern Germany or Scandinavia. So Bordeaux, there were push factors and they were pull factors is the point of that for Irish merchants. Irish demand was also strong. The elites in Ireland consumed a great deal of wine. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Chesterfield, had many things to say about Irish wine consumption, but among others that Irish gentlemen, that is the elites in Ireland, drank huge amounts of it and that it ruined their fortunes. But they thought of this as something important to show their magnanimity. They had to serve and drink large amounts of claret, which they did much to the detriment of their own health and indeed funds, but it did show that they were magnanimous, and it also represented their masculinity in many ways. So the Irish themselves, especially the elite, were big Bordeaux wine drinkers. Taxes in Ireland were also more favorable to the importation of Bordeaux than British taxes were. That is, even though they shared the same king, they actually had different tariff structures until, get this, 1853. Well, so Ireland was a big market. You see here some statistics that I've put up. Ireland, again, imported more wine from Bordeaux than all of Britain, but Irish merchants had access to both markets. Some statistics from 1768, which are taken from records in Bordeaux, roughly 75,000 tons, that is a type of barrel of 252 gallons, were exported from Bordeaux. Roughly 1,000, again, these are round numbers I've made round for the sake of putting statistics on a screen. 1,000 or so went to England, about half of that to London, where the most expensive wines went. Roughly 6,000 tons to Ireland, 20,000 tons to French colonies, the least expensive wine. Mostly, when I said French colonies at this point, mostly means to the Caribbean, and then 48,000 tons to places like Brittany or northern France, and of course, what we would now call northern Germany, as well as Scandinavia. But there were qualitative differences in all of that. The Londoners in general drank the most expensive wine. Dubliners also drank very expensive wine, but England drank the fanciest wine. Scotland slightly less so. The Scots liked to smuggle a great deal of French wine, I should point out. And in Ireland, where wine was less taxed, there was much more open trade. And there they drank all qualities of Bordeaux, both the very best and the slightly less good, although never the cheap stuff that was exported on to Germany and Northern Europe. Well, as a result, what then happened was all of these ambitious Irishmen who were not born into land headed off to Bordeaux in order to make their fortunes and hopefully come back and be gentlemen upon their return. That is, having made enough money to purchase land, they could then make their money from the income of their land and not have to actually work for a living, so to speak. That's what actually constitutes a gentleman, by the way. So you see here the names of various families, the Bartons, McCarthys, Dillons, Galways, Lynches, Blacks, McMahons, Coppingers, etc. I'm not going to read the whole list, but they're up in front of you. Those are some of the names of the various Irishmen who, along with their families, went to Bordeaux, some of whom actually did indeed make very large fortunes. But again, what's critical is these were the men who were raising the wine. That is, they are really what today we would call the wine maker. By the way, this also often happens in California. That is, a winemaker will buy juice that is high quality juice from someone who owns the vineyard, but then will turn that juice into a fancy wine by all the processes we spoke about previously over the course of 2 or 3 years before selling that wine. So again, just because you own the vineyard doesn't mean you are the wine maker. And most of these men, or when they initially got there, none of these men owned vineyards, but they still were the ones who made the wine. Over time, those who could afford it became wine makers, or vineyard owners, I should say, which gave them gentleman status. It also became part of what business people call vertical integration. That is, they own the process from start to finish. Well, it's also important to say that Ireland had something the French wanted, in particular salt beef, or what we call corned beef, butter, flour, pork also, but salt beef in particular. Why did the French want that? That is what made this exchange work. That is, the boats going out to Ireland and to Britain laden with expensive wine had to have a return cargo or the business wouldn't work. Well, the French desperately wanted corned beef, what it was called salt beef by the Irish, and that was to feed their navy, their merchant marine, because of course it was preserved form of protein that wouldn't go bad on the high seas before refrigeration. But perhaps most importantly, that was the primary form of protein for the enslaved Africans in the French West Indies, places like Santo Domingo, now called Haiti, or Guadeloupe or Martinique, where they were making sugar, which really was the oil of the 18th century, and an even greater source of wealth for Bordeaux than wine. So, of the roughly 300 British nationals in Bordeaux in 1756, that is the outset of the 7 Years' War, 85% were Irish. They dominated the trade of the best properties. To give you an example of that, here you see Thomas Knight, an Irish clerk, who, writing to a member of the Hennessy family, also, of course, Irish, said that old Will, that is William Barton, has surprised the great ones. He bought up every drop of Lafitte, Latour, Aubryon, and Kirwan's. Well, you probably have heard of Chateau Lafitte, Chateau Latour, Chateau Aubryon. We've already spoken about 3 of the most expensive wines in the world, and all from Bordeaux. And interestingly, Chateau Kirwan. What's interesting there is that Kirwan himself was an Irish merchant who became a landowner. And today you can still buy Chateau Kirwan. It is one of the wines in the area around Margaux. So again, the Irish dominated the upper end of the market, even though it was the English in particular who were drinking the most expensive wines. It was Irish merchants who were selling it. Again, these merchants were making wine to fulfill the demands of the British and Irish markets, which were the most lucrative. Those people, that is, that market, wanted full-bodied, smooth, dark-colored wine. They didn't want the old-fashioned rosé that had been claret for so many years. They wanted this new high-quality wine that tasted like Aubryon. And so the merchants obliged them. They transformed traditional claret into a high-quality wine, and they did this gradually across the board. So what started as a tiny percentage of Bordeaux red wine, that is, initially that aim for quality, was just Aubryon, and then it expanded into a few other vineyards. And then over time, that became the model for almost all of Bordeaux. So today, as I said, it's very hard to find Claret de Bordeaux, and it's very easy to find red wine from Bordeaux. At the beginning of the 18th century, however, Claret de Bordeaux was still dominant, and the dark wine was in the minority. But these Irish merchants, fulfilling the demand for darker, full-bodied, smooth wines, helped to transform the nature of Bordeaux wine in general. Well, the reputation of Bordeaux wine then spread throughout the British Empire. You've probably heard of this man or seen this man or recognized his face, certainly on the right. That's Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, born British, but he happened to be born British in the colony of Virginia, and over time, of course, would think of himself no longer as British, but as American. He was an avid wine drinker and wine lover. Good wine is a necessity of life for me, a famous quote that winemakers and wine drinkers like to repeat because they feel the same way. He spent some time in France, as you probably all know, and in fact made a journey down to Bordeaux. because he wanted to see where this wine came from. And when he went to Bordeaux, in his notes, he wrote, among the principal wine merchants in Bordeaux are Gernon, Barton, Johnston, Forster, Skinner, Coppinger, and McCarthy. Well, all of those families he mentioned, except for the Skinners, who were Scottish, all the rest were Irish. That's Thomas Jefferson writing in Bordeaux in May 1787. But it's exactly the people like Jefferson, who were part of the British Empire, even though in his case he broke away from that empire, who then spread the reputation of Bordeaux beyond simply England, Scotland, and Ireland to other parts of the world. Jefferson also, by the way, bought wine for his friend, the first president of the United States, George Washington. And he bought wine, again, from these various merchants, Irish merchants, who were selling the very best Bordeaux wines. But it's in this way that Bordeaux wine, because it in many ways was part of the English-speaking world and a part of the Atlantic world, was spread by these Irish merchants, not just to England, Scotland, and Ireland, but also overseas to places like the young United States of America. Well, what about here in North Carolina? We finish up with this. If you look at this map, you see on the right, in the yellow area, that's essentially muscadine territory, where grapes like Scuppernong are grown. It's too hot and too humid to grow European grapes. Actually, the origin of those grapes is in the Caucasus, so sort of where Europe meets Asia, is where Vitis vinifera come from. That is the grapes made that make European style wines. In the central section, which is eventually Piedmont, there you see an area which is good for both muscadine type grapes, as well as being okay, I should say, for European grapes. And then you have some areas up in the mountains, both in the northwest, west, and southwest, where it's generally too cold for the Scuppernong grape. And so there they focus almost uniquely on European grapes. Interestingly, among the grapes that they try to grow in both the Piedmont and up in the mountains are Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. And again, what you should by now come to see or understand, because of what we've been speaking about, is the reason they are trying to grow those grapes, Cabernet and Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, which may not be the best grapes, by the way, for our state, but nevertheless, the reasons they're trying to grow them is because of the fame of Bordeaux. They are trying in many ways to produce a wine that tastes like that which they know, that which has become so famous, Bordeaux wine, and the grapes, again, from Bordeaux that have created the greatest amount of fame for Bordeaux wines is Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. So if you're wondering why we're trying to grow those grapes here, even though it may not be appropriate for our climate, it's certainly not in the eastern part of the state, but even in the Piedmont and the mountains, the reason we're growing those grapes and not others is precisely because of the fame of Bordeaux. Well, on that note, it's been exactly 44 minutes. I will stop and answer your questions. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to questions and trying to answer those. Alexander, are you there?
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Ludington. That was an excellent presentation. The first question comes from John King, who said that he prefers blackberry notes in a wine. Is there a wine that you could recommend for purchase locally? And thank you for a very informative presentation.
So, but he prefers what though?
Blackberry notes.
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, there are a number, and I don't know what wines that he is able to buy through his local store, but I guess I would say for blackberry, if you like fruit forward wines, I would say Right Bank wine. So you might want to, in that case, again, this all depends on budget, but look for a wine that is Merlot based, If he can afford something that comes from Saint-Emilion, why not go straight to the top? Or Pomerol would be another option. Or a wine region or wine sub-region within Bordeaux that is much more affordable, that you see increasingly in North Carolina is Castillon, C-A-S-T-I-L-L-O-N. You see Bordeaux Côte de Castillon sometimes on the bottle, if it's not just a generic Bordeaux. And that by nature is going to be a Merlot-based wine. And that's fairly fruit-driven, very often, again, depending on the producer. I can't say exactly if it's going to be blackberries, but you should be able to find blackberries in those Merlot-based wines coming from the right bank.
Thank you. And so the next question comes from Michael Bowen, who asked if there was a channel or website that you have where we can learn more information.
Wow. Well, that's an excellent question as well. I am just starting a little side business of giving this kind of talk and doing tastings. So you will soon, if you, it's not up and running, but if you follow my name, I'll soon have a website where I will, again, you can contact me through that website, and I'd be happy to speak much more about the history of wines, to lead wine tastings. So not a channel, but yes, a website, and again, a business that I've just recently started because I enjoy doing this kind of thing so much and have been doing it in various venues for a while. I thought time to take my show on the road. So I look forward to hearing from those people who are interested in the future.
Great. And also from Michael Bowen, if Europeans differentiate between wines based on the region from which it originated instead of the grapes from which it was made, how do they know the flavors of the wine they are buying?
Another excellent question by Michael. Generally speaking, because there are, as I mentioned in some of the, as you saw in some of those slides, Michael, in Bordeaux, for example, there are only 6 red grapes that are allowed to be used. Well, now, as a wine geek, I should pause and say, caveat, just last year, a few other grapes were approved because of global warming. But broadly speaking, those won't have any effect for some time. They may never actually have a big impact. But each region limits the type of grapes that can grow and still use the name of that region. So in that sense, what happens is consumers begin to associate certain flavor profiles with a region precisely because that region is growing only those grapes. So again, for the Bordeaux region, if it's on the left bank, it's Cabernet Sauvignon dominated with a smaller amount of Merlot, maybe some Malbec, maybe some Carmenère, maybe some Cabernet Franc, maybe some Petit Verdot, but broadly speaking, it's Cab with the minority of Merlot. On the right bank, it's Merlot with usually a minority of Cabernet Franc, which is a parent of both Bordeaux. Sorry, it's a parent of both Cabernet Sauvignon and of Merlot. So they're related in flavors because they are genetically related. So French consumers and European consumers in general know what the region tastes like because it will be consistent in its flavors because the grapes themselves. So again, Michael, another example, and an easier one to understand is Burgundy. You buy a Burgundy, it's red, you know by definition, by law, it has to be Pinot Noir. If it's white, it's from Burgundy. You know by law, it has to be Chardonnay. There's one exception called Aligoté, which is hard to find in America. But broadly speaking, Burgundy, if it's red, is Pinot Noir, and if it's white, Chardonnay. So that's the way, because those regions each limit what can be grown and still be called Bordeaux or Burgundy or Champagne or whatever, what have you, then people associate certain flavors with regions without having to know the grape types.
I have a few questions related to North Carolina wines. So from John Hemperly and H. Lesnick, what would be great grape varieties for North Carolina? Would white be better?
Again, that's an excellent question. We are a fairly large state, we run obviously east-west. We have mountains, we have the sea, we have sand, we have clay, we have schist, that is a kind of breakable rock. We have a lot of different, so it's hard to say any one particular one. And certainly in the eastern part of the state, I think the native Scuppernong grape is, you can't beat it. It's from around here, it's native to that. It's got thick skin, which handles the heat and humidity. We're not going to improve on that from anything imported from Europe. In the Piedmont area, I think grapes that come from farther south, because of the heat we have here, would do a little bit better. So it's possible the Tempranillo grape or the Grenache grape might do a little bit better. There are some grapes up in the northwestern part of Spain where it's also quite humid, but can be quite hot. And northern Portugal that might do very well. Touriga Nacional, for example, from northern Portugal, is actually one of the big grapes that makes port wine, but it now makes a lot of still or table wine too. When you buy a wine from the Douro Valley, D-O-U-R-O, that's almost always a Touriga Nacional plus other things. So those are some of the grapes that I think are more appropriate for both the Piedmont area and going up. I mean, the Yadkin Valley is still Piedmont, but that's really where it's when you get a little bit cooler than, say, Chapel Hill, Raleigh, Fayetteville, Charlotte, but a little bit farther west, that you really get into interesting wine territory. And again, I think looking for similar climates in Europe where those are grown is the best thing, and similar soil types.
On a related note, from Sid Hartman, what is the genesis of the wines grown in and around the famed Biltmore estate?
Oh, that's a good question. And unfortunately, Sid, I don't really know the answer to that question exactly when they started. I think it had to do with the idea of creating sort of an elite environment, for lack of a better term. That is, when Biltmore Estate stopped being the actual home of the Vanderbilt family, but was a money-making enterprise for visitors, the idea of planting grapes there to then, because wine itself in the United States, especially in the Southeast where we don't grow many grapes, still signifies sort of elite status in many ways. I think that is unfortunate, but that's what it does in many cases. And so I think they began to plant grapes there, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 1970s and 80s. And even now, they still import some grapes. So sometimes you'll see a bottle there, Sid, that says American wine, because a number of the grapes come from California to supplement the grapes they grow at the Biltmore Estate. And then occasionally, of course, their premier bottles say North Carolina wine. But as far as I know, that wasn't done by the Vanderbilts themselves, who certainly could have afforded to purchase whatever Bordeaux or Burgundy or Champagne they wanted to, coming in from Europe.
And from Kathy Kahn, what effect did Stephen Spurrier have on the French wines and their success here in the US? The 1776 famous tasting sure made an impact on the future of US wines.
Well, Stephen Spurrier just passed away, and I'm sure that was a typo because it was 1976. But the contest that he set up, he was an English merchant, and he set up a contest in Paris where he had a wine store, and in that contest where the wines were tasted blind, American wines defeated French wines, according to a panelist of French wine drinkers. So that was an amazing moment for American wines, especially for California wines, in as much as Spurrier was out to show that America could make really top ranking wines. And as I said, the French wine panel did not know what was in each bottle or in each glass, and gave the top prize in both the red and white to American wines from California. And so that was a moment of great pride for Californians, to some level, to some degree, a humiliation for the French, although the French pointed out, you could line up a different set of French wines to go side by side. Moreover, we produced many more, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, it really showed that America could compete at the highest level. So that was incredibly important for the American wine industry to know that they could compete. And I think it also, because it made such a stir, the so-called Judgment of Paris, which was the name given to this event, it made the news, and all that was obviously news that helped to spread the word of the American wine industry. And I think more Americans, perhaps many Americans who previously had said, no, I'll just stick with the French or the Italian and the Spanish, began to say, look, I'll try something else. I'll try something from California. And California is, of course, had been already, but continues to be the primary producer of all wines consumed in America.
We have time for one more question, and this comes from Cecilia. Are there any good documentaries that you could recommend that would cover more on this subject?
Wow. Well, I'm working with some English and Irish producers on a documentary myself called Green Wine, but that won't be out for some time. There is, on the history of wine, I don't know of anything. Well, let me go back and say, Hugh Johnson, actually, probably here. This is probably the best set of documentaries that I know. Hugh Johnson, an Englishman, very involved in the wine trade, a phenomenal wine writer, wrote a book called Vintage: The History of Wine. And from that, there was indeed a series of documentaries that he made that deals with wine history. Now, only some of the episodes will touch upon the kinds of things that I spoke about today. So I'm interpreting your question, or the question as specifically about what I said. Some of Johnson's documentaries will deal with them. Nothing I know that deals precisely with this. If you want to get into some of the more controversial aspects of winemaking, there's a documentary called Mondo Vino, which sort of takes Robert Mondavi to task. I think it's somewhat unfairly at times. I'm not sure, it doesn't really deal with wine history per se, although a little bit certainly in America, 20th century France, 20th century, and contemporary winemaking rivalries and ways of making wine, and the fact that some wines are made on an industrial scale and some wines are very boutiquey, and I think that doesn't necessarily indicate quality. Some wines that are made on a very large scale are incredibly good because a whole lot of money is put into making them on that scale, and a wine can be made on a very artisanal scale, but if it's not made carefully or by a good winemaker, even if it's only 50 cases, it's bad. So the amount of wine produced is not necessarily an indicator of the quality of wine that's produced.
Thank you, Dr. Ludington, and thank you everyone who asked questions. Appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure, Alexandra. This has been another fun evening for me. I hope it's been fun for everybody out there in Zoom land. And again, if you all are interested in more of this, I'll have a website up and running under my name. It'll be under Charles Ludington. You'll be able to find it. And I'm happy to do more of these types of talks for the settings and a variety of settings. So please be in touch. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. And I also hope that next time I do this, we can be live in Raleigh.
That would be so wonderful. Maybe possibly a screening of that green wine when it's ready, maybe.
Well, that'd be great. That'd be great.
And hopefully many other programs. Thank you so much, Dr. Ludington. It's always a pleasure. You always give such a wonderfully entertaining and historically rich program. We just really appreciate your time.
Well, again, my pleasure. I look forward to doing this in the future.
And thank you to all those of you who joined us this evening. We hope to see you on June 24th at 7 p.m. for our next History and Highballs Grove Park Inn for a virtual tour and history of this beloved North Carolina landmark with historian Bruce Johnson. Have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you all soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.